Hi everyone, welcome back to Alice on the Giant Bookshelf. Last year I set myself two lists of 23 books for 2023. The question is, did I actually read any of them? Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books. And as I said in the introduction, last year I overly ambitiously set myself two lists of 23 books for 2023 that I wanted to read. The first one being 23 classics for 2023 and the second one being 23 crime and thriller for 2023. So today's video is all about how I got on with that and whether that was a good idea. I think we know the answer to the second question because I've already said in my 24 books for 2024 that there would be just one list this year. So yeah, I definitely have learnt my lesson, and yeah, I thought we would just wrap up how well that went, and I'll very quickly speed through each of the books and tell you whether I read them or not. So starting with the 23 classics for 2023. Out of the 23 books that I set myself, I actually managed to read 11 of these books, which is not great, and I am currently reading one other on the list. So a few of these have been added to my 24 for 24. I'll mention which ones those are when they come up. For my crime list, not all of these were from my giant TBR. Some of them were for the Killer Reads Thriller Month Book Club. I didn't do that well at keeping up with the Killer Reads Thriller Month Book Club this year, and unfortunately I only got to 12 out of the 23 crime books in total, and of those 12 I DNFed 2 and I read all the way to the end 10 of them. I also do have one on that list that I am sort of still currently reading. I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to that book. Without any further delay, and without dwelling on the fact that that means I would have read all 23 had I combined the two lists together and just set 23 books, let's move swiftly on and have a brief look at each of the books. And I'm going to do the classics first, books that I read first, and then books that I didn't read second, and then the same for the crime list. The classics list never really got off to a very good start because in January of 2023 I did start the first book on this list, which was To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This was my first attempt at reading Virginia Woolf, and I did eventually finish it, but I finished it in October. So yes, I will definitely give Virginia Woolf another try, but I'm not sure if her writing style is for me. It may be some time before I do try another one. I did read the second book on my list, which was Jamaica by Daphne du Maurier. This was the FOMO book club pick for January and February last year, and I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I would highly recommend this as one of Daphne du Maurier's best. It's full of dark atmosphere and just a really great read, especially in the winter months. So recommend that one. Also in the month of January, I did read this one as a buddy read, which was The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. I read this with Gemma from Gemma Books, and I definitely think that I had some problems with the pacing in this book, but I would still go ahead and read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the follow-up. But again, I won't probably be rushing out to get to that because while I liked a lot of things that this book did, there were plenty of things that I didn't love as well. Another one that I read that is probably the chunkiest book I read this year was The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. I read this as part of a read-along with the lovely Becky from Teacup the Storyteller, and this read-along was running from February into March, and I did finish this on schedule in March. It's not my favourite Dumas. I did actually prefer The Count of Monte Cristo, even though it's a much longer book. I thought this was funny in places, but I disliked the characters quite a lot more than I thought I would. Another big chunky book that I got through this year was Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. This was another buddy read with Sandy from Ms Reads a Lot and Gemma from Gemma Books. We started this in April and the plan was to read it in April. I think I finished this one in May, and again, it was a classic I was really, really looking forward to, and it wasn't as amazing as I had hoped it would be. I did really, really enjoy the part of this that dealt with the crime of the title, but I wasn't so engaged in the rest of it. Next up, we have another Daphne du Maurier, Frenchman's Creek. I also read this as a buddy read with Emily from Novelle Novels, Ange from Ange's Book Chatter, and Gemma from Gemma Books. And we read this back in September. Again, it was a really good read, although I didn't enjoy it as much as Jamaica Inn. But this one is much more piratey, and I would describe this one as a bit of a romp. If that's your mood, I think this would be a good Daphne du Maurier for you. And the next one that I did read was The Canterville Ghost by Oscar Wilde. This was one of 2 Oscar Wilde short stories that I had placed on this list, and I didn't get to the other one. I thought The Canterville Ghost was great. I buddy read it in April with Berna from Berna's Bookish Adventures. It's a bit of a short story of 2 halves. I thought the first half was hilariously funny and the second half was actually quite sad and took an unexpected turn, I would say. The next one I also buddy read, and that was one of the oldest books on my TBR, Bulldog Drummond by Sapper, and I buddy read this with the wonderful Janelle from Too Fond of Books, who sadly passed away in June, so I'm very, very grateful that we buddy read this, not only because I got to talk to Janelle about one more book, but also because without Janelle, I wouldn't have pushed myself to read Bulldog Drummond at any time soon, and it was a really good surprise. I would say this was the most surprising on this list. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's definitely a predecessor of James Bond, even though I haven't read the James Bond books. There was a lot of elements that reminded me of some of those films. And this could also definitely be described as a romp, a bit of an adventure, a bit of a sort of crime thrillery classic. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading this with Janelle back in April. The next one that I also really enjoyed was Diary of a Nobody by George and Whedon Grossmith. I read this in Victober and it was funny, but not as funny as I had anticipated it was going to be. But if you are looking for a way to get into reading Victorian books without reading something that is too taxing, I would highly recommend this one to you. The other hilarious Victorian book I read this year from this list was 3 Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. And this one really did make me laugh. I found this laugh out loud funny in places, and I really enjoyed this book, which was another buddy read, this time with Lynn, who is Flick Reads over on Instagram. This was just such a funny book. I can't recommend it highly enough. This is one of my favourites from this list this year. I also got to another Thomas Hardy book. It wasn't the one that I expected, but it was Jude the Obscure, widely agreed to be Thomas Hardy's most depressing book. And I'm glad to hear actually that it's his most depressing book, because I don't think I could take a more miserable book from Hardy. But I did still really enjoy reading more Hardy. This is excellent, but a severe lack of hope in this one. That brings me to the end of all the ones that I actually read. The one that I'm currently reading is, of course, Dombey and Son, which I'm just over 100 pages into. Gemma from Gemma Books has challenged me to finish this book this year in 2024, and if I don't finish this in 2024, apparently I will be sent a copy of Moby Dick. So if that isn't the encouragement that I need, I don't know what will be. So this is definitely a plan to be finished in 2024, hopefully quite soon. So with that, we come on to the classics that I did not get to, and I'll run through them quite quickly. So we have The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe. This I have added to my 24 books to read in 2024. We have Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, another one that I've added to my 24 for 24. 3 that I did not add to my 24 for 24 but would still like to get to are Black Beauty by Anna Sewell, The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, which I'm especially keen to get to since reading another Shirley Jackson book for the FOMO book club, and Lord Arthur Savile's Crime, was the other Oscar Wilde story that I didn't manage to get to. I also didn't get to two books that are not on my TBR, which are Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. I was a bit Victorianed out by the time I'd started Dombey and read some other Victorian books in Victober. But Barchester Towers is a book that I hope to get to. The other one was an author who I said I would like to get to, which was James Baldwin. I've still never read a book by James Baldwin, but I'm hoping to rectify that this year sometime. And these last three were also added to the 24 for 24. We have Cranford and Cousin Phyllis by Elizabeth Gaskell. I actually listed both of these on the 23 for 23 as separate books, and it's Cranford that I intend to read for my 24 for 24. But if I get to Cousin Phyllis as well, that will be great. Also adding to my 24 for 24 is The Collegians by Gerald Griffin and Flight of the Falcon by Daphne du Maurier. So hopefully I will definitely get through those on my 24 for 24. So moving swiftly on into the crime books. First of all, we have the ones that I read and that I DNF'd. And I'm starting with the ones that were books that I read for the Killer Reads Thriller Month book club. I don't remember if I said, but this is hosted by AJ from AJ Dunn Reads and Writes. First of all, I read The Expendable Man by Dorothy B. Hughes. I would definitely try more Dorothy B. Hughes. This was a really well written book, a pleasant surprise, and I was pleased that I read it. I also read The Martian back in July on audiobook for this book club, and I sadly didn't enjoy this one as much as I had enjoyed Project Hail Mary, but that is for a very specific reason, which is that in Project Hail Mary, I just loved it so much because of one specific character who comes into it. If you've read it, you'll know who I mean. And unfortunately, there was no such equivalent in The Martian, but other than that, it was a bit too similar for me. It wasn't a favourite. Night of the Hunter by Davis Grubb was probably my most surprising find from this list. I enjoyed this one so much. It's a really, really good short crime fiction thriller book that had me absolutely on edge and reads almost like horror at times. But I would highly, highly recommend this as one of the best thrillers that I actually read this year. I did also read The Favour. This was a new one that was coming out by my favourite husband and wife writing team, Nikki French. And unfortunately, this isn't my favourite of the Nikki French books. I would say that this one is a little bit too far-fetched. I found it quite difficult to suspend my disbelief on this one, but it was still an enjoyable read nonetheless. I also read Blue Moon by Lee Child, which was the next book in the Jack Reacher series that I needed to get to. And again, this wasn't my favourite in the Jack Reacher series, not my favourite Lee Child book, but it was still fun to read at the time. And I always do enjoy a Jack Reacher, even if it's not my favourite one. Now, the first DNF from either of these lists came in June, and it was Blowfly by Patricia Cornwall. I made a whole video about DNFing this Kate Scarpetta series. If you want to check that out, I'll link it in the description down below. But the best thing about DNFing Blowfly was that it led to a massive unhaul of all the Patricia Cornwall books, and that meant at least 5 unread books leaving my giant TBR, so I was thrilled with that one despite it being a DNF. One that I did really enjoy was Birdman by Mo Hader. This was a buddy read back in June with Ollie from Criminoli, and this is really, really brutal. I would not recommend the Mo Hader books to anyone who is easily unsettled by crime reads. This is the start of the D.I. Jack Caffrey series, and I really enjoyed it and would like to read the rest of the series, but it is very, very grisly, and there was also an actual jump scare in this book, which is the first time I can remember encountering that in reading. Another mystery I really enjoyed picking up this year was The Red House Mystery by A.A. Milne. This made me wish that A.A. Milne had written more mysteries, but he sadly only wrote this one, and I do have a standalone review of this if you would like to see that. I will link that as well. I also worked my way slowly through Killer Come Back to Me by Ray Bradbury. I think I started this back in March and finished it sometime later in the year, maybe September, and it collected all of Ray Bradbury's crime-related short stories. I definitely think that Bradbury is more accomplished at sci-fi short stories than crime ones, but this did contain an absolute favourite short story that I think did so much for like playing on our fears of being followed, and that one was called The Whole Town Sleeping, so I would highly recommend that one. And there were several in this collection that I also really enjoyed, and I still want to read all of Ray Bradbury at some point. I also DNF'd Flesh and Blood by Caroline Mitchell. This was one that I just couldn't get into. It wasn't gripping me, so I decided to put it down and DNF it. I read The Bone Collector by Jeffrey Deaver with Jolene from Bookworm Adventure Girl, and we read this back in August. This was a thriller that I felt had a lot of deeper issues in it that we ended up talking about, which I wasn't expecting at all, but again, a good start to another series. Finally, from this list, I read Missing You by Harlan Coben back in June and July, I believe. Again, this was not my favourite of Harlan Coben's work, but it did still have some elements that I really enjoyed. It also had some negatives to it. I didn't think the characters were particularly great in this one, and I also thought there were some elements to the plot that I just found a little bit unbelievable. But nonetheless, it was an enjoyable read while I was reading it. And the book that I'm currently reading from this list is the Mike Hammer Omnibus, Volume 1 by Mickey Spillane. If you saw this in my September wrap-up, you would know that this has 3 Mike Hammer books in it, and I have only read one of them, and I wasn't quite sure whether to DNF the rest of the collection, but I've hung on to it for now. It's still on the giant TBR, and I have 2 more stories in here if I do decide to read them. My Gun is Quick and Vengeance is Mine. So if you've read either of those 2 and you want to encourage me to read them, do let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I may possibly DNF this, or I might give it another try this year. So that one's kind of currently on the go, but not really. So I didn't read from this list Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John le Carré, In the Woods by Tana French, A Rage in Harlem by Chester Himes, and Fatale by John Patrick Manchette. Those were all books from the Killer Reads Thriller Month book club that I just didn't get to, although some of them I would still like to get to. I also didn't get to The Last Remains by Ellie Griffiths, which is an audiobook that I really still want to get to. I can't remember if I might have put this on my TBR for January, in fact. A couple of the others that I didn't get to were the next books in series that I was reading. There was In a House of Lies by Ian Rankin, which is the next John Rebus book that I need to read. I didn't get to the next book in the Will Trent and Dr. Sarah Linton series by Karen Slaughter, which was Unseen. I didn't get to the only Tesca Ritson book I have left on my shelf, which is Bloodstream. This one isn't actually in a series, and I think I have tried to start it before because there's a bookmark in it, but it still remains unread, and I'm pretty sure this is in the TBR tin as well. And I didn't read The Last Detective by Robert Craze, but I do still intend to read this. And I don't know where it is, but I also didn't read The Neon Rain by James Lee Burke. So those all remain on my TBR. Overall, my success rate, I suppose, was half, plus a couple that I did start. I think that this has definitely taught me not to make 2 massive lists of books that you say you will read in 1 year. Like, in terms of numbers of books that I have read this year, I definitely could have managed to read these 46 books. But I obviously chose to read other books instead. Of my 46 books I selected, I read 23, including 2 DNFs in that number. And I think that that is enough dwelling on 2023. I hope you've enjoyed this video today, and do let me know in the comments if there are any of the ones that I didn't read that you think I should prioritise. And if you read any of the ones that I did read, do let me know and we can chat about it in the comments as well. If you have enjoyed this video today, please do give it a like, and please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And if you made a list for 2023, I would love to hear how you got on with it. I'm going to try really hard to read my 24 books for 2024, and I will leave that video here for you to watch if you would like to. If you don't have a comment you would like to make, please do leave me some kind of emoji relating to this video. I'm not sure what that would be. And I will hope very much to see you all again very soon for another video all about books, hopefully ones I've read this time, here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.